So what you have in front of you is an SAT prompt that's a sample, and what I actually want to do is get us kind of started brainstorming about things. So why don't we take 5 minutes and just look at the prompt, come up with an outline about what you would write about. So think about what your body paragraphs will be and what your thesis is going to be, and write them down. So we're just going to do a 5-minute brainstorming session with the prompt that you have. If you don't have a pencil, there's some in the back, I believe, in the cup. ideas written down yet? You guys done brainstorming? Yes, now? So this is roughly how much time you should have for brainstorming. If you're not done, we're going to kind of talk about strategies to get faster. But how many of you kind of would probably want more time for brainstorming? A couple of you, right? Let's talk about that. Like, what did you kind of get stuck on? Was it like picking a side, thinking of examples?
Most of the SAT prompts I've seen before are usually like one side or another, but this one, it's not too obvious sounds.
Like it says, how should it be addressed? And I think it's hard coming up with solutions to many of the problems that people come up in the world.
Okay, so it's hard coming up with solutions. It's also a very unusual prompt. So most of the SAT prompts you'll get, and we'll talk about another one, but they're going to be kind of picking one side or the other. But sometimes they will throw you a prompt that is completely out there. Like, tell me about an injustice that needs to be addressed. Or, like, what is one problem that needs to be solved? This prompt has come up before. So it's kind of like, how do you attack sort of a random prompt like that? Because you only get one. You don't really get a choice. So you have to kind of think about that. But also it might be hard to think of, ideas for how to provide a solution. And so it's also called your reason. So why is this an injustice that needs to be solved? Why is your solution better, right? So you would have to be able to back that up kind of with evidence. Anything else that made it difficult? For those of you guys who did finish brainstorming, how did you guys organize your paragraphs? What did you come up with?
3 reasons.
Okay. What were your 3?
So my injustice was racism, and I talked about one of them was that to teach that it's wrong, and another one was to outreach, to talk to different people and make sense of different cultures. And my third one was taken from a historical figure, Martin Luther King, how he advocates for against discrimination.
Okay. So your third reason
Was an example, but I didn't finish.
Okay.
That one.
Okay. What about the rest of you guys? What other injustices did you guys come up with? What did you come up with?
Oh, greed.
Huh? Greed. Okay. What was your solution?
I didn't really have time to think of it.
Okay. So you spent your time thinking about
Why is that?
okay, why is that? What else do you have? What did you come up with?
Like how girls and minorities, they're not allowed to go to school and they can't class. I kept to go to school.
Okay. So
I heard that one in conference about that girl who spoke with the UN.
do you know her
All
name?
of them.
Yeah. So access to education for girls in certain countries.
Yes, for different people.
What's your solution?
My solution is like, I don't know, I don't know, it's hard to come up with a solution for that.
Okay. So still thinking about solutions. What about the rest of you? What did you come up with?
I had discrimination, but I didn't really have a solution.
Did either of you guys start on thinking of solutions? No. Let's just go around the room. What injustice did you have? Okay. I don't know. Is that injustice? What do you guys think?
It's not fair that someone should have to be
Argue that it's an injustice. So one of the things that you want to think about is whenever you approach any prompt, there's always a key term that you're going to have to define. Right? So you need to define what injustice is. What does that mean to you? Is it unjust when someone steals your candy or copies off your test? Is it unjust when you're not allowed to, when you don't have access to food or education? You need to make a definition. So everybody write down what you think your definition of injustice is. Once you have your definition, I want you to think about how the thing that you picked to be an injustice, how does that fit into your definition? Because you're gonna say, you're gonna have to say, this is why it's unjust, right? You're gonna have to explain that. For example, you had greed, right? Why is greed an injustice? What's your definition?
Oh, I put when bad things happen to people and they didn't cause it.
Okay, so when bad things happen to people and they didn't cause it, that's an injustice. Okay, so how does greed fit into that?
I guess like when other people are greedy, it can cause it can like people take advantage of like other people get what they want, and it's like unjust for those people that are like getting stuff anyway.
Okay. So greed is unjust because you're causing bad things to happen to other people, right? So now if you look at your solution, or look at your definition, part of your solution has to solve that problem, right? Part of your solution has to make whatever you've defined as injustice not be true anymore. Does that make a little bit more sense when you think about it? So how can, if we want to tackle greed, we need to do something about it that makes it not harm, or that makes us stop harming other people through greed, right? So that would be part of the solution. So that's one way to brainstorm, is to define your term. For those of you who haven't come up with your solutions yet, think about that a little bit. Jonathan, what was your injustice?
Corruption.
Corruption, okay. What's your solution?
I didn't really think of any.
Okay, what's your definition of injustice?
When something unfair is happening,
Okay, so we also have when something unfair is happening. How many of you guys had something like that? Like when something unfair is happening? Okay. How do you stop unfair things from happening?
to make things fair.
Okay. How do you make things fair? Anyone? What are some ways to make things
You
make
give people a sense of moral and what's right and what's wrong, and how to be fair. So you
Okay.
teach them.
So you could teach them, right? You could teach them how to be fair. What's another way? How else can you make people fair?
Discipline those who are not being fair.
Okay, you can discipline those who are not being fair, right? Okay, so that already gives us two. One is you can teach them to be moral, and one is you can discipline them, right? How does that relate to corruption?
You can discipline people so they won't be corrupt.
How are you going to discipline them? Be more specific.
Like punish them.
That's the same word.
If they do something,
Like punish them, like
if they do something bad,
what kind of punishments?
taking away their job.
Okay. Okay. So you could fire them? Yeah. That might stop corruption.
Isn't it kind of like naive to think that you can stop corruption just by setting down laws and whatever?
We will talk about
Or like greed, because greed is like an equality. And then, like, are you gonna like absolutely eradicate greed from the world?
That's true. So what you're kind of getting at with that question is, how do you prove that your solution is valid, right? It's
Yeah.
possible. So one thing that you should include in every essay is actually an acknowledgement of the other side. So we'll talk about that more specifically. But in every essay, you kind of need to be like, well, someone's going to disagree with me and be like, that's not going to solve it, and then you have to kind of refute it. Next question?
It just says how should it be addressed. So it never says you actually have to solve it. You just need to address it somehow.
Well, how would you address it without solving it?
Like you can try to improve the situation because that would fit the definition of addressing a problem. But you don't
Okay.
have to actually solve it.
This is another case of defining your terms, right? Your major terms are probably injustice and also address. What do you mean by address? Do you mean just talk about it? Or do you mean improve or solve?
Or you can even say that like this problem, you can't solve this problem. Like you can just like that. Like, oh, I read over this problem. Oh, can't be solved.
Okay, but then you have to give me another definition of address. Because
Yeah.
you can't say, if they ask how can it be addressed, you can't say it
I
can't
just
be
like
addressed.
given attention to.
Okay, so then you would define it as giving attention to, right?
Yeah.
Bringing awareness. So you always need to define your terms because that's going to determine your argument. Your argument's going to be, if you want to solve injustice or at least address it, you need to say, well, what does that mean? What is a great injustice? Is it a great injustice to get a B? I don't think so. Some people might. But you have to define injustice, but also define address, right? So we just had a really good point here that address does not necessarily mean solve.
Would you include your definitions in your essay or not?
Well, you wouldn't want to say my definition of injustice
Yeah.
is, right? But you do want to make it clear kind of what you're pointing out, right? So then you might want to have a sentence in there that says, while this injustice cannot be solved, we can address it by bringing more awareness to it, right? That's kind of the definition inside the sentence. Yeah, but so we were talking about corruption, right? So one way to address it would be to punish people. We weren't really specific about how, but maybe like fire them or send them to jail, right? What about our other things? What about teaching people morals? How might that stop corruption?
Well, if you implement it when they're young, like more likely they won't become corrupt in the future if that's like one of their key morals.
So you could teach them the morals that would lead them to not be corrupt,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so there we go. We got two really good body paragraphs, or ideas for body paragraphs there, right? So that might be a part of your solution. And then you would want to have examples for that, right? Like, why would that work? So you might want to state something, let's kind of brainstorm that a little bit. What kind of example could we have for solving corruption through discipline? You guys have any examples?
When presidents have affairs, they get impeached.
Okay.
That's a big deal.
Except for
Well, if it's except for Bill, then what is our specific example?
I don't know. What's one president build?
Unless if you're popular and you apologize in front of them, then that's fine.
Well, who did get impeached?
Nixon, but he didn't have some. He just
And
got
Johnson.
Okay. So we got Nixon and Johnson, right? So they were disciplined, right? For what? What was the corruption there?
Nixon's tapping into like fund wires and like searching all this money.
Okay, so he was doing sort of illegal surveillance, right? How does that fit into our definition of corruption? Isn't corruption doing unfair things? Right? How is that unfair?
Because people are supposed to follow the legal system, and when they don't, that's unfair for the majority of the people that do.
Right? Okay, so we have certain rules in society, right? About where you can have surveillance, where you can't, what's allowed, what's not allowed. If you don't follow those rules, that's unfair for everyone else who does, right? So that would be your analysis. and then you would apply that to Nixon, right? And then there you would have your entire body paragraph. So it all kind of relates to your definition of your term and how that fits into your argument. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah? And then okay, so I think probably we'll get started with like the intro stuff, but I just kind of wanted to kind of work through the brainstorming process, and what kind of things you should be thinking about. You don't want to just be like, well, I need to spend a lot of time thinking about what that injustice is, because no one wants you to pick like the one perfect injustice, that is like the ultimate injustice. You just need to pick one, the first thing that comes in your head, define what injustice is, explain why that's unjust, and then think about how you can fix it through your definition, right? Does that kind of make sense? Yeah? Alright. Okay, so we're going to kind of go through, just sort of a warm-up, but we're going to kind of go through the basic kind of structure of the SAT, for those of you who don't know, and then kind of ways to tackle the different sections, and then we'll kind of come back to the essay at the end, and try to apply some of the things that we just talked about. Alright. So, okay. So this is kind of basic overview. There's 3 kinds of sections. So critical reading, writing, math. When they say writing, that includes grammar and then also an essay. And then you always have like one experimental section, which could be one of those 3, but they never tell you which one that is, so you have to pretend that it's a real section. You can't bomb it, but it doesn't actually go into your score. And then you have 2 question types for critical reading, which is sentence completion and reading. Passages. For writing, there's 3 different kinds of grammar things. So one is sentence errors, and then we have improving sentences, and improving paragraphs. And then we have an essay, obviously, which we just talked about. And then for math, there's multiple choice and student-produced response. And you can kind of see how things are weighted. So one of the things is that sentence completion takes up probably a little under a third of our total questions. So reading passages is really important. So you can kind of see how things are weighted. Improving sentences is also kind of weighted differently than sentence errors or improving paragraphs. And then we also have the multiple choice versus the student-produced response. So kind of knowing what's weighted in certain ways can help you kind of strategize a little bit, because you want to get those ones. You want to really tackle how to answer that kind of question, because some are worth more than others. Alright. So the total test is 3 hours and 45 minutes, which is a really long time. It's a very long morning. And so what you kind of have to work on is sort of like your test-taking stamina. So one of the things that I sort of recommend, especially getting closer to the test, is taking full practice tests, because you want to, like, if you're doing some for homework, that's fine, and you're going to work on kind of individual test-taking skills. But if you don't take it all at one time, it's going to be really hard for you to know what it feels like to be on hour number 3 and like checking through those questions. So towards probably the last 6 weeks of the test, you should be doing a practice test basically every weekend at the exact time that you're taking the test. You want to really simulate it. And the other thing would be to simulate it kind of in a similar test environment that you would be in when you're taking the actual test. Studies show that if you study in the same place that you're going to take a test, you tend to remember things better, because people remember things kind of in context. So if you remember yourself studying in a certain kind of classroom and then you take your test in that way, you're going to recall that material actually faster than you do, maybe at home or wherever you're studying. So you want to simulate the test-taking environment as much as possible, whether it's time, location, even like what you're wearing. I would have to say, like, if you're in your if you're really good at taking like tests in your pajamas, that does not help you on test day. So you want to pretend that you're actually taking the test when you're doing it. The other thing I want to point out is the essay is worth 30% of your writing score. So a lot of people kind of think, well, I can get all the multiple choice right, I'm not a good essay writer, but it's okay, it's only out of 12 points. It's not true. The essay is worth 30% of your total writing score. So what you want to do is do really well in that, because every single extra point you get, like say you get an 8, if you bump your score up to a 9, that's 30 extra points, right? So it's like freebies. So you want to really get the essay strategy down. The essay is between 2 to 12 points. So it's basically you have 2 readers and they score you between 1 to 6, unless you're off topic or you don't write an essay at all, then you get a 0. But your essay score is between 1 to 6 for each grader. And so that's kind of where the ambiguity is a little bit, because you could have a perfect essay structure and really good logical reasoning, but the last kind of point or two, so from the 10 to the 12, sometimes it depends on style and depends on what kind of style that your reader likes. So you can kind of work on that, but I would have to say the last 2 points can be a little bit difficult depending on kind of like your style of writing. So you would have to work on like individual style, sentence variation, that kind of thing for the extra 2 points. For multiple choice, you get a 1/4 of a point off for every incorrect answer, except for the student-produced responses, which are grid-in answers. So sometimes you want to think strategically. If you completely can't rule anything out, you might want to leave that question blank. But the rule is if you can rule 2 things out, you should always guess. Because probability-wise, you're more like, it's more worth your time to attempt to get that extra point than to take the penalty. So if you can rule 2 things out, then you should always guess. And then your final score is rounded to the nearest whole number. So if you're at like 40.75, then you get a 41. And then the total sections are from 200 to 800 points, times that by 3, you get 2,400. You guys should know those basics at least. Okay, so one thing we're going to do really quick is a sentence completion question. And what I kind of want to stress for strategy for sentence completion is so 2 things. 1, don't look at the answers before you think of what should go in the blanks, because they're going to confuse you. So we're going to ignore all of this and tell me, what do you think should go in the 2 blanks? These blanks. So both blank and blank. Wilson seldom spoke and never spent money. What do you think should go in the first blank?
Quiet.
Quiet. Yeah,
Or like-
why?
Because he never speaks. Or quiet like in class, like doesn't talk a lot.
Okay, so it doesn't talk a lot, right? Because we want him to, he seldom spoke, right? So it's very like, by definition, whatever goes in here should be seldom spoke. What about the second blank?
Not spending money.
Okay, the second blank should be not spending money, right? So there's no interpretation in these questions. It's like someone who's both quiet and doesn't spend money. He was quiet and didn't spend money, right? It's super simple. So sentence completion is purely vocab, because you have to know what these words mean. So how many of you guys know what vociferous means?
It means loud, basically, right? Like loud and rowdy.
Mm-hmm. How do you know that? Do you study?
No, I know the word.
Okay, you know the word. Okay. For those of you who don't know the word, how can you guess what the word means?
It starts with VOC, sort of like vocal.
Uh-huh. So it starts with VOC, like voc, right? Vocal.
Oh, also the other way is generous, and it's like the opposite of like the correct answer. So I would assume that the first part would be like loud.
Ah, okay. So you're guessing based on the second question. So you're saying that if it's generous, it might be loud. That actually, you might want to kind of shy away from that, just because sometimes the words are going to be, it'll be one word is right and one word is wrong. So it's not always that both are wrong at the same time. But one way we can know what this word means is because of the first 3 words, right? So we got, what other words have voc in it? Vocal.
Voice.
Vocabulary.
Sounds like voice. We got vocabulary. Yeah. So evocative.
Provocative.
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 Provocative. Okay. So we have voc in there, right? So we know that it has something to do with voice or being loud or talking. So that's what's called like grouping things by roots, right? And a lot of you guys probably don't know that you're doing it, but one way to memorize vocabulary, because you have to memorize vocabulary, there's no cheats for that, is by memorizing roots. Because if you recognize that it has voc in it, you don't even really need to know what it means. You can kind of just assume that it has to do with talking, which is the opposite of not talking, right? Okay. Do we know any of the other words? Actually, let's take a guess. What do you guys think? Huh?
I think it's D.
You think it's D. Why?
Because taciturn means like, I thought it meant like,
Silent.
yeah, taciturn means like seldom speaking, I think. Yeah.
Mhm.
Then
He's quiet, yeah.
miserly means like, miser, like, he doesn't like to spend his money, he likes to collect it and keep it like for him.
Okay, so someone who likes to hoard their money, someone who's probably very cheap, right? Okay, so our answer is D. And one way to tackle the kind of questions that has two answer choices is to only look at one side or the other first. So say we look at just these ones, right? What can we rule out? What does not mean not spend money?
Generous.
Okay, so we got not generous. What else?
Who means like, miserly.
Stingy means you don't want to spend money, right? It means you're not very generous with your money. Frugal means you're not generous, you're cheap, right? Miserly means you like to hoard money. What's munificent?
Guessing that spends money.
So
First
we
word
got
sounds like money.
so we got mun in here, right? Can you guys think of any words that have to do with money that have mun in it? We do have municipal. I think that's another word. I can't think of it right now. But yeah, so this word means generous. So obviously it can't be A and E, right? So even if you didn't know what any of these three words mean, I would guess, because you've already ruled out two. But we're going to go on. So what do these three words, out of these three, which one does not mean not speaking? Yeah, what does that mean?
Yes.
Talkative, right? What's effusive? Anyone? Okay, expressive. Gushing, right? Like if you're very effusive about, I don't know, the new, whatever movie's out, then that's gushing, right? So that's the opposite of what we want. So that gives us D. But one way to do this is to kind of, if you don't know what all the words mean, try to rule out the ones where the other side could be wrong, and then come back and kind of think about what things sound like and how to guess. But there's really no substitute to memorizing vocabulary. So one thing that you should be doing for SAT is memorizing vocab. There's kind of, like, if you don't know what the words mean, it doesn't just affect the 1/3 of the questions at sentence completion, it affects your reading comprehension. Because in the reading passages, they're going to be asking you, this word means this in context, and you kind of have to know what the words mean. You also have to know what the passage is saying, which means you should understand the words. So you guys should all be memorizing vocab. And there are a lot of resources for memorizing vocab. There's online flashcards that are for free. There are flashcards you can buy from Kaplan and Barron's. And then there's also kind of like vocab workbooks if you want to work on that. But one easy way to kind of boost your vocabs without having to really make as much effort as like memorizing each word one by one is to study roots. So we just talked about vociferous, right? And it means crying out loudly or noisily, clamorous, but it comes from vox, which means voice. So then you just have to think vocal, and then everything with voc in it has something to do with speaking or talking, or having a voice, right? And you can kind of get this from a lot of other roots as well. So memorizing roots is actually the easiest way to come up with groups of vocabulary to memorize together. So the next part of critical reading.
So would you say studying roots is like more important than studying like individual words?
I would say you should do both. So get a roots list, get a list of common roots that are important, get a vocab list, and match them up. There's no reason you should memorize vocab words from A to Z. You usually get stuck somewhere around like A, like the end of A, because you're just like, oh, these words all start and sound the same. You got obey, to bridge, abdicate. You just keep going. It's super boring. But if you have a roots list, then what you can do is, as you go through the list, kind of be like, oh, these words all have the same root. So you put them in a list. So what I would do is have a roots list and then pair them with different SAT words. I think that's really helpful. So what we did with some of the students is if you get an online vocab list, like 5,000 SAT words or whatever, and you have it online, right? So you can just do Control F and search, and you just search for that root. Like today you're looking for VOC, so you just do Control F, and then you type in VOC, and then it gives you all the words with that root in it. Some of them are not going to be actual roots, because sometimes you just get a word that like has that spelling in there, but that's clearly not the root of the word, so just take those ones out. But it gives you a lot of them. And it's really helpful for certain words if you can kind of see the connection. Because once you figure out the connection between certain words, then it makes it a lot easier for you to remember what they mean too. For example, if you get the word magnanimous, right? Do you know what magnanimous means? Man, you know all the vocab words.
It means generous of heart.
Okay, it means generous of heart. Do you know what the roots are?
Magnum meaning big, and animus meaning mind. I think.
Spirit.
Spirit.
Spirit, right? So you got animus meaning spirit. What other words have anim in it?
Animal.
Animal. Okay. Why does that have that root in it?
Animal has spirit, soul.
Uh-huh.
Say animated, spirited.
Okay. Something that is animated has spirit, right? An animal has spirit. So this kind of goes back to the Latin where they kind of, at some point these philosophers decided that plants don't have souls, but animals do, right? Animals have spirit. And so they decided to call them animal, right? So if you know where the lineage of the word comes from, you're like, oh, okay, that's why magnanimous is related to animated, which is related to animal, when the words kind of seem like they have nothing to do with each other, right? But then every time you see magnanimous again, you're going to be like, okay, big spirited, or big spirit, which means you have a big heart. Yeah?
Yeah.
Roots are really helpful. Oh, okay. So when we go to tackle reading passages, the first thing you want to think about, because I know that for most of you, you're going to read the entire passage. You're just going to start and you're going to read it all, and you're going to be like, okay, so that's what it's about. Now I'm going to look at the questions, right? But the thing that you have to actually think about is, why are you reading this passage in the first place?
Answer the questions.
Yes. You're not really, this is the sad thing about the SAT, you're not really reading the passages for knowledge. You're not like reading it because you really want to know about like the conifers and how they're different from the other trees, and you're not really reading it because you want to know the difference between dialect and slang and jargon, or the plot of the story if it happens to be a literary passage. You're not really reading for knowledge. You're reading because you want to get an 800 and because you want to get the most questions correct. So don't read the way you read for school, right? The way you read for school is you're reading for information. You're reading to kind of understand and learn stuff, and then you answer the questions because you already comprehend it. But you don't really need to do that for the SAT because you're not retaining it in your long-term memory, and because like it takes a lot of time to actually understand a concept, right? If you're studying for school, like if you're taking APUSH, any of you, or I don't know, I guess if you're taking a lit class, like you're reading because you want to understand the plot, you want to understand the themes, you have to think deeply about it. You don't have time for that on the SAT, so you kind of have to see what you can get without actually understanding that much. Is sort of your goal.
That sounds like a horrible way of testing.
It is a horrible way of testing, which is why a lot of colleges actually have a problem with the SAT, but they still require it as of now. So you gotta figure out how to do it, like play the game. But you're not actually gonna learn from taking the SAT. except for test-taking strategies. So the first thing you want to do is don't read the passage, right? So you want to look at the questions first, because the questions are going to determine how you're going to look at the passage. You're not going to look at the passage and be like, okay, it's all about these things, and now I'm going to go answer these questions. So the questions are a bunch of tricks. So you're going to get tricked if you read the passage first, and then you start to answer the questions, because they have a bunch of things that are going to confuse you. It's going to be about the wrong part of the passage, all that sort of stuff. So don't read the passage. What you do want to do, so actually I'll start tossing these out, but so what you do want to do is read the opening blurb. So they always include this thing in italics that tells you what the passage, where the passage is from, and what the main idea of the passage is, right? They're going to be like, this was written by an author in the 17th century, or by an African American about the legacy of slavery. Like, they'll always tell you what the main idea is, actually. So that gives you context. So you just have to read it and then be like, okay, that's what this passage is sort of about. And then you want to skip the entire passage and go to the questions. And you don't actually want to answer the questions in order. What you want to do is figure out which questions to answer first, which questions to leave towards the end. Because there's kind of a strategy with that in terms of time, right? You don't want to read the passage 5 times trying to answer the questions. You want to read it through once, maybe twice. Probably you want to aim for like 1.5 times. Like one time really quick, one time just to answer the questions, and then one time really quickly just to make sure you got the whole idea. And what you'll notice, so let's take a look at the questions. What I gave you is a double passage, which tends to be the harder ones. So what you'll notice is some of the questions have line numbers stated, right? And some of them don't. So circle the number for all the questions that have line numbers stated. How many did you guys get? 6, which ones?
16, 17, 18, 19, 20.
Okay. So you've got 6 out of the 10 questions, right? Those all have line numbers in them. And then you want to kind of look through just the questions, not the answer choices. Look through the questions really quickly. Do we have more? You're the expert. I don't know.
Do you want to read it?
So if you look through the questions, the ones that you didn't circle that don't have line numbers, they seem to be very general, right? So both authors agree on which of the following points. So that requires you to read the entire passage before you can answer, right? Yeah? So don't answer that one first, leave it last. If we look at 16, it just gives us this word most nearly means. You can probably answer it by not reading the entire passage. And then same with 17, same with 18. What about 19? Can you answer that without reading the entire passage?
No.
No, right? Because it asks you what the person from passage 2 thinks. So you would want to skip that one. 20, 21, you can answer without reading the entire passage. 22, 23, and 24 both talk about both passages, right? So you don't want to do those ones. What you want to do is just the ones that refer to the line number, and you only need to read that part of the passage. That's what you want to focus on. So the first thing you want to do is try to answer those questions. And so before you do that, what I want to note is the line number almost never has the answer. So this is one of the secrets. They're going to give you the line number, and then you're going to read that line, and you're going to be like, I don't see the answer. What is the answer? And then you're going to guess. But the answer is not in the line number. It's always above or below. Usually it's the sentence above or the sentence below, depending on what the question is. So look at the ones that you can answer right now, and go ahead and answer those, kind of keeping in mind that the answer might not be in the line that they state. You guys got done? Anyone need like another minute? Yes? You guys ready? Okay. Okay, so you guys should have just answered 5 questions, right? 16, 17, 18, 20, 21, right? Yeah? So we're gonna correct them really quickly. This is not how you would actually take a test, but we're gonna correct them really quickly. So 16, C, 17, E, 18, D, 20, D, 21, E. We didn't do 19. Okay. So 16, C, 17, E, 18, D, 20, D, 21, E. What did you guys do? Anyone get them all right? Ooh, a couple of you. Good. Okay. So you'll notice that 16 and 18 are actually vocab questions, right? So if you take a look, this word most nearly in line 33, sign most nearly means, or in lines 5 to 6, finished off most nearly means. So these are vocab questions. They're a little bit different from the sentence completion because they require you to understand sort of secondary or tertiary meanings of a word, how they're used in context. So did anyone miss 16 or 18? No? It's pretty good. But if you happen to not know what that word means, one thing that helps is to take the definition in one of the answer choices and stick it back in the sentence. And if it doesn't make sense, that is not the answer. So for example, if we took like number 16, right? So we have defeated, terminated, completed, disposed of, consumed totally. If we look at lines 5 to 6 and we stick that back in, so these warheads were actually spear points elegantly chipped to sharpness on both edges and defeated with a groove. Sounds weird, right? So that can't be the answer, even though that is what finished off could mean. So they're not looking for the immediate definition, they're looking for kind of which definition does that word fit under. For the other questions, so if we look at, say, anyone miss 17? Couple of you? Yeah, 17 is one of the harder ones. So we get the quotation in lines 21 to 22 serves primarily two. And so this question requires you to kind of know why you would put a quotation in a passage. So what you really want to think about is not what the content of the passage is, but what is the organization, right? What is the point of putting in a quote? Normally, if you put in the quote of an expert, why would you do that?
To increase credibility of your case.
Okay, so maybe to increase credibility. Why else?
To summarize a comprehensive.
That would be the answer. Yeah. But to kind of represent a certain point of view, right? We could say like most scientists think this way, and give a quote by a scientist thinking that way, right? So it could be used as an example to exemplify the entire thing. But sometimes you use a quote to refute. Sometimes you use a quote to increase credibility. Or to provide evidence, right? So a quote, it could be a quote of a guy saying, I did this study and it showed blah, 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 right? So that would be evidence. So those are all reasons why you would have a quote. And then you want to look at the passage and be like, why is the quote in this particular passage? So when you read the sentence that they quoted, right, lines 21 to 22, you just get this prominent archaeologist stated, Clovis is taken to be the basal of the founding population of the Americas. That does not tell you why it's there, right? It just tells you where the quote is. So you want to figure out why it's there. Is it above or below? above, right? How do you know that?
It says scientists usually describe the closest people of region.
So if you look above, you get scientists usually describe the Clovis people this way. And then you get archaeologist says, kind of similar thing, right? You know it's not the sentence below because you have a transition word there, right? You have the word but, which means that we're changing points of view. So if we got but in the past century, such certainty has dramatically been shaken, that means that the things above are not the same viewpoint, right? The things above are not that viewpoint. So that quote isn't put in there to refute, to offer an opposing viewpoint. It's put in there to show you what those scientists think, right? If you look in the line above. So that gives you summarize a common understanding, which is the understanding of the scientists. Does that make sense for those of you who missed that one? Let's look at 20. Okay. So for those of you who picked D, why did you pick D?
Because the latest idea was that they used boats.
Okay, so the latest idea is that they use boats, right? If we look at line, what is it? So they give you line 44, but the answer is actually after. So the latest idea has people ditching their crampons and spears for skin-covered boats. And the sentence that kind of gives you the answer is actually the next one. So maybe the first Americans came not by land, but by sea, hugging the ice age coast, right? So if they came by sea in boats, what should they have? Should they have fishing hooks? Maybe. It's not, I mean, it's boat related, right? Cooking tools, not boat related. Arrowheads, not boat related. Boat anchors, got the word boat in it, right? And then fossilized mastodon bones, no, right? Doesn't have to do with boats. So then you just got fishing hooks versus boat anchors. But which one has more to do with traveling by boat? Boat anchors, right? So that's kind of why you would want to pick D. It seems really simple, right? Like, kind of like, almost like they're tricking you because you're like, can't be boat anchors. It's so obviously boat anchors, but it is.
I'm just wondering, how would they date boat anchors? Because, or if they're made out of stone, you can't carbon date stone. So
It's true, unless they found the boat anchor in a layer of rock that they knew dated back a certain time period. Yeah. But here in this answer, in the answer choices, the years actually do not matter, right?
Yeah.
They're do they?
The reason you don't choose fishing hooks is because it's at 9,000 years ago, and they're talking about 13,500 years ago. So it has to be before that. So it has to be before that.
Okay, so you could use that to kind of justify your answer, right? They do give you a date. It also takes extra time to double check that date, right? So you can do that if you have extra time if you're a quick reader and you have extra time, you can double check that date. But you can kind of reasonably, so remember if you can rule out two things, you should guess. If you have fishing hooks versus boat anchors, you're going to be like, well, I can check this date, there's probably boat anchors, so I'm just going to pick that first and maybe check it later. But it will match because they can't be wrong actually in their multiple choice. Okay, now let's look at 21. So the author of passage 2 implies that the findings of the geologic studies are. How many of you guys got this wrong? A couple of you. What did you guys pick?
A.
You picked A? A? A, right? You guys picked A? So your answer is actually E, right? Why did you pick A and not E? I just want to know.
I guess because it said something about coastlines in both of them.
Okay, what about the coastlines?
ancient mariners could have had smooth sailing through relatively unchanging coastal environments, and then the next sentence says there were thawed pockets of coastline.
Okay, so you think that the theory is unchanging coastal environments, and then they proved that theory by the geological studies? Okay. What is the theory that we're talking about here? For the geological studies, what does that support? What is the theory?
It was possible.
Huh?
It was possible.
Okay, that it goes along the theory that it was possible to sail along the coast, right? But if we get the geological studies, does that prove that it was possible? Is it like certain proof?
No.
No.
Actually,
Okay.
it's not proven that it's possible, it's proven that they did do this.
So so if you look at the geological studies, right, it's saying there were thawed pockets of coastline where people could take refuge. It's not saying that the geological studies prove that they took refuge. It's just that they could because it's thawed. So it's not saying that they did fulfill the seafaring theory. It's just that they could have, right? And that's why it's not also. That's also why it's not proof, because it's not that they did. It's just that they could have, right? But kind of the center there is the sentence that comes after that sentence, right? So we get another scientist, and he goes. So anthropologist Robinson Bonnichinson. So he says the peopling of the Americas is likely to be tied very much to the development and spread of maritime adaptation, right? So our last sentence is saying that this theory is very likely. It doesn't say that this theory has been proven true, right? So that last sentence in the passage tells you it can't be A, it has to be E. Because it's increasing plausibility, but the theory is not necessarily true. So, like, the way that you were kind of thinking it is you were logically thinking the sentence before is about this thing, the sentence after is proof of that thing. But what you really want to be doing is thinking, what is the topic sentence of this paragraph? Like, what is this paragraph about, right? It's about the seafaring theory. And then, how do we conclude? We conclude that it's likely to be true. So the answer is around the line, but not on the line. Okay, so we have 5 other questions to answer. So if we look at that, because double passages, sometimes they will ask you questions about both of the passages, and sometimes they'll ask you about the main idea for the individual passage. So you want to do a really quick check that there isn't a question that's only about one of the passages. So if we look at 15, it says both authors, right? 19 talks about both passages. 22, 23, 24, all about both passages, right? So we know that we need to know what both of the passages are about. So based on what we've read, most of the questions the line-by-line questions have been about passage 1, right? So you can kind of skim passage 1 right now and tell me what it's about. So do that really quickly, look at passage 1 only, and write down like a couple of words, maybe like 5 or 6 words, that's just your summary of what you think the idea of the first passage is. And you should always do this for double passages so you have the point of view really clear, because if they ask you to compare, you need to know which side is on what. Oh. Okay. You guys done? If you're not, you're taking too much time. You know why you're taking too much time? Because you only need to read the topic sentences. Okay? So, if you look at passage 1, you're kind of starting off with some sort of anecdote, right? Like any introduction. It's not like super important information, it's just anecdote, saying some guy found warheads, right? So the first paragraph is like your intro. And then if we look at your second paragraph, you're just like, what is the main idea of the second paragraph? So always kind of think about the structure of the passage. What is the structure? We're starting off with some sort of intro, right? And you're like, okay, whatever. And then your first paragraph, or second paragraph, you're going to be like, what's the main point? So our main point is that we have these Clovis people who use them in the Americas, no earlier than about 13,500 years ago, right? 13,500 years ago. Okay, the second paragraph, just these people existed in America, right? Third paragraph, the most straightforward challenge to the old story is the matter of time. So that tells us that the previous passage gives us one theory, and then we're going to refute that theory because of the matter of time, right? And then if you maybe skim a little bit, you're going to be like, okay, they're going to give me a bunch of evidence about why time matters, why it's wrong that they were in the Americas at this time. So if I were to summarize passage 1, it would be what?
Presented findings that like disproves of popular
Okay, and what's that theory?
the theory is that the Americas were populated by people moving along the continents.
Okay, so we have this theory that is the Americas were populated by these Clovis people who got there by land, and that's wrong, is what passage 1 is, right? So that's all the information you really need to know for now about what passage 1 is about. Now move on to passage 2. You only got one question about passage 2, so you can spend a little more time reading it. So read that and then jot down some notes about what it's about. As you're reading through the passage, you should be looking for two things. The first thing is, what is the main point of that paragraph, right? So think structurally, all you need to know is the main point of each paragraph. If it's evidence for that paragraph, you don't really need to read it that carefully, but just find the main point of the paragraph. That's one thing you want to look for. But sometimes the paragraph has a turn in it, right? It has a however. So you also want to look for key terms like that. Transition words and words that indicate cause and effect are really important. So every time you see a but, circle it. Every time you see a however, circle it. If you see something that kind of is evidence for something, then you just need to know that it relates to that other thing. Or if you see cause and effect, mark it. But you want to know how the ideas are progressing. So always think of your passage in terms of structure, right? You're trying to mark up your passage to make it easier for you to take the test. not easier for you to understand. So you don't need to mark it up the way you do really in school, where you're like marking up key terms and I don't know what else you guys do, like highlight key facts and things like that. Because in the second paragraph, we get a lot of kind of howevers in there. Yeah, but the latest idea, blah, blah, blah. But as the timeline has changed, yeah, those are two of the important ones. And then at the end, right? But the peopling of the Americas is likely. So that gives you 3 different places where you're kind of like, okay, the idea is changing here. What is the main idea of passage 2? What's the point?
See if you travel as good as possible.
Okay, so traveling, the first Americans might have traveled there by sea, right? Okay, so we got one that's saying that the Clovis people couldn't have gotten there because of time, and then the other one saying maybe the first Americans traveled by sea, right? Okay, go ahead and answer the rest of the questions that you haven't answered yet. guys need more time? A little bit? Anyone? You guys good? Yeah? Yeah, okay. Let's go over the answers. So 15, C, 19, B, 22, C, 23, B, 24, D.
What was 15?
15, C. Yeah, 15, C, 19, B, 22, C, 23, B, 24, D. Raise your hand if you got 25 or 15 right. Okay, about half of you. 19. Same half. 22. More of you guys. 23. Same. 24. Who didn't get any of them? I hope you guys are not raising your hand because you're just lazy. Okay, so let's look at number 15. Both authors agree on which of the following points. So our answer is C. Where is the evidence for that? Where's the evidence in passage 1 that overland travel is difficult? Yeah?
In the last paragraph, where it says in an ice-free corridor between Siberia and North America was often open.
Okay, so line, what is that, 28? Line 28? An ice-free corridor would not have been open much before then. Okay, so that's overland travel being difficult. What about passage 2? Where's our evidence?
It says, during the most recent ice age, the New World was pretty much closed to pedestrian traffic. The Northwest corridor in Canada would have been covered with ice.
So it's very early on in passage 2, right? The New World was pretty much closed to pedestrian traffic. So basically the point of number 15 is for you to be like a human Google search. You just have to find the evidence that proves those points. There's no really any interpretation involved. You just kind of have to find that exact sentence that proves your point. I guess for those of you who got it wrong, what'd you guys pick? Don't be shy. It's okay. Did anyone pick B? So, like, the evidence for B is in passage 1, right? We talk about big game, right? Big game hunters. But it's only in passage 1. So a lot of the time they're going to give you answers that are half right. This is kind of like the sentence completion. Like half of the answer is right, but the other half is not, so you have to double check that. And then also, why is E wrong?
Because it says it disproves it in passage 1.
Where?
In the end, it says,
The site in
acceptance
Chile.
of Monte Verde.
So people lived there about 1,000 years before the first sign of Polish people, right? So you can find evidence that disproves it. So the evidence for that is in the text. You just kind of have to hunt for it. But if you have an inkling, like you can remember that they talked about overland travel, just find that part in the passage and confirm it. And then you kind of don't have to check the other answers because you already have the solid proof that that's the right one. If you go and check all the answers, then you're going to start like thinking, well, that sounds kind of like that, and that could imply that this is that. But there's no kind of like implying or interpretation. You just have to find the exact sentence. Okay, let's look at 19. So the information presented in lines 25 to 36. 25, Exactly. So that's just the third paragraph, right? The one about time and people living there beforehand. So maybe you're kind of like thinking about, oh, well, what does people living there beforehand mean? But what you really have to think about is, what was the thesis of passage 2?
They travel by sea.
Yeah, okay, so the thesis of passage 2 is they travel by sea. So even without really looking at the lines yet, I would be like, okay, what could it possibly be or what could it not be, right? So if I look at A, so validates the notion that they came shortly after the recent ice age. Maybe, I'd have to check the passage. Adds credibility to the theory that the first Americans arrived by boat. That's what passage 2 is about, right? Indicates that overland travel was not possible, demonstrates that early Americans must have relied on the sea, and then reveals that archaeologists can differ over even the most basic facts. It's probably not E, right? Because E has nothing to do with the sea, which is the main thesis of passage 2. And also passage 2 does not argue that archaeologists differ over basic facts, right? So you can rule out E. You can probably also rule out D, because if you remember anything about passage 1 did not talk about eating anything other than big game, right? So you probably rule that one out. So you just have to be like, okay, is it overland travel? Is it the theory that they came by sea? Or is it validating? Kind of actually without really looking at the passage, just kind of being like, oh, it's that paragraph. I would just guess B, because it has to do with the exact thesis of passage 2, right? You can validate that by checking to make sure that's kind of what that passage is about. But like, they're really asking you to guess, and you're kind of like, you have to guess what passage 2, with the guy who wrote passage 2 would say about passage 1. But you know, the only thing you really know is like the point of view of the passage 2 guy, right? The current point of view. You don't know really how he would interpret this information. So your answer is probably just going to be the thesis of passage 2. And so that's kind of one way to kind of be like, well, it's probably this one because that's the thesis. And then you can check the other ones to kind of be like, well, is that what passage 2 says over passage 1? Okay, if we look at 22, okay. So our answer for 22 is C. So why is it not number 2? Why is it not the exact date the Americans were initially settled?
Because it only said 13,000 Americans. Sorry.
And it didn't tell you like the exact year.
Oh, wait, it was
So both passages, right?
yeah, but in fact,
There are no dates in passage 2 except for the 1970s. That's difference.
Okay. So we don't have the exact date in passage 2, right? So it's obviously not that, right? That's the easiest thing to rule out. There is no exact date in passage 2. And then what you actually want to do is look at the answer choices. So if it can't be 2, you can already rule out B, D, and E, right? Which leaves you with A and C. So A must be correct. You don't even need to check if A is correct, right? A is automatically correct. And then you just have to check 3, right? So references of possible food sources. What's the reference in passage 1?
Big game.
Yeah, Macedon and good game, right? What's the reference in passage 2?
Shells.
Yeah, so like fish and sea mammals, right? So then we're like, okay, evidence for that, it's C, right? So you kind of want to think about it strategically. You don't have to check every single answer. This is a quicker way to do it. Just kind of see what's left. Okay, what about 23? How did you guys find the answer for 23? Okay, so they quote people, right? So you've got a lot of different things. So political allusion, direct quotation, rhetorical questioning, extended metaphor, personal anecdote. Which ones are the easiest to check for? Direct quote and maybe anecdote, maybe, because you could find a story, right? You could be like, was there a story in there? So those are probably the 2 easiest ones to check for. So I would tackle those ones first. Don't start with A and be like, where's the political allusion? Because you're not going to find it. but you can check the easier ones first. So, be strategic about how you tackle the answer choices. You're gonna be like, okay, direct quotation, do I have one? I see one there and one there. And it happens to be, actually, this one should be easy for you because two of the questions that we just went over with the line numbers are about those quotes, right? So, we already talked about Frederick Hadley West, and we already talked about Robson Bonnickson, right? So those are already in the questions. If you answered those questions, you should already be like, well, I already answered 2 questions about quotes, so the answer's direct quote. You didn't even have to check the rest. Okay? Time-saving strategy. And then if we look at 24, so which best describes the relationship between the 2 passages? Okay, so you have the 2 sentences, right, that you guys wrote, or like the phrases about what passage 1 and passage 2 are about. So that can kind of help you figure out what the relationship is, right? So even without looking at the answer choices, because they might confuse you, what is the relationship between passage 1 and 2? If you look at the 2 things that you wrote down.
They're both about something that they used to think was true, and then they haven't. But then they realized maybe it wasn't true. And then for passage 1, it's why it wasn't. Well, for passage 1, it's evidence for why it wasn't true, and passage 2, it's sort of an explanation for why it wasn't true.
Okay, what wasn't true?
So, the theory about how the Clovis people were first.
Okay, so the theory about how the Clovis people first got to America, right? So passage 1 is about how the original story is not necessarily correct about the corridor. And then passage 2 is like, well, maybe the first Americans, who are not necessarily the Clovis people, but maybe the first Americans came by sea, right? So if we look at the answers, does passage 2 disprove something from passage 1? No, right? Does it examine a term? No, right? You don't even have to check if it is a term. There is a term. Just no. If we look at C, the origins of an ancient technology. Like, you'd have to be like, what ancient technology are you talking about? So, probably not. But if you look at D, you get passage 2 presents a theory that can help explain a finding mentioned in passage 1. So we have kind of a theory that furthers, so they work together, right? A theory furthering what's from passage 1. And then if we have E, then we get archaeological discovery. Was there a discovery that verifies the central claim? No. Was there? There was an archaeological discovery.
Discovery and there was a claim, but they didn't really have much to do with each other.
Yeah, it doesn't validate the central claim of passage 1, right? So you want to be kind of careful about the wording there. Because it's like the half right, but actually not answer. Where it has part of it, you're like, oh, there was an archaeological discovery. Must be that one. But if you read the rest of the sentence, it verifies the central claim, right? And the central claim is this thing about the matter of time and how the people got there in the first place. And that's not what the tools and evidence about crampons and stuff. That's not what that's about. It's like evidence for seafaring exploration. Yeah. Do you guys have any questions about these passages? I kind of went over them pretty clearly. So just to kind of recap, some things you want to do. You want to mark up your text and you want to underline key details. So underline sort of like what you believe to be the main point of the passage. You don't need to underline everything, just kind of find the key sentence. And sometimes that includes looking for transition words. So like words like therefore, however, for example, because then you can just block that off as being like example, right? So you know that's not part of the main idea. When you make notes, you want to focus on the structure of the passage, because that's going to help you find the answer. A lot of the questions are like, why is this in the passage? Why is it in the passage? It's usually to refute something, to show cause and effect, to be like, this is the result, or to be an example, like a supporting piece of evidence, right? So you want to know what each part of the passage is for. You know, does passage 2 and passage 3, do they support each other, or are they against each other? Are we presenting a new idea in passage 3? Is it a continuation? That's what you want to be actually thinking about. And then you do want to justify your answers with hard evidence, so you want to find the exact quote in the text that gives you kind of that answer. If you're kind of like interpreting and thinking too hard about it, that's probably not the right answer, because you're not supposed to actually think very hard. You're supposed to just like search and reinterpret the words and be like, oh, not interpret, but like kind of, if they say seafaring, then the answer might have maritime in it, right? So it's just like changing the words up a little bit, but it kind of means the same thing. Yeah. Okay. Then we're gonna go over math really quickly, because math has a little bit of reading stuff in it. So those of you who have taken the SAT math, you'll realize that the concepts are actually not that hard. You only have to take up to like geometry to take SAT math. You don't really need to know anything about trig, except for that a triangle equals 180 degrees, right? Like basic stuff. Still kind of, yeah, still basically geometry. There's very little trig you actually need to know. So it's not that hard, it's just really tricky. So all of math is a lot of tricks. And a lot of that has to actually has to do with, you know, kind of looking at the question and being like, what are they trying to trick me on? And then kind of like understanding that trick and then turning kind of the words into an equation. Because a lot of the time they'll give you like something really wordy where they're like, and then I bought 50 of these, and then yesterday I bought these, and then you just have to figure out, you know, how do you translate those words into an equation. So I'm going to give you an example. So try to solve that one. You guys solve it yet? Yeah? What's your answer?
E.
Okay, I heard different things. Okay, so our answer is E. Right? So let me go. So how can we rule out A or B?
Because it doesn't.
There's a 50. Well, not a 50, it's like, it's
It's like,
kind of,
You don't know for sure.
they can line up knowledge. There's obvious, it's
Not
obvious
must
like
be.
tons of.
there's
like,
no reason for either one to be.
Yeah, there's.
Yeah, there's no reason for either one, right? We don't know how many people are in this class. There's no the first one's a girl, but there's no reason why either, like, the last person is a boy or a girl, right? So we can rule that one out already. Why can we rule C out?
Because
Okay, so because of the first sentence, right? Twice as many boys as girls. So it can't be C. So then you just have to figure out there are at least 2 girls standing next to each other, or at least 2 boys, right? If we say that there are twice as many boys as girls, you just have to turn that into like a really simple thing. So you're going to be like boy, boy, girl, right? That's one possibility. Or it could be girl, boy, 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 girl, boy, right? Those are our only 3 possibilities, right?
Wait, no, it says the girl has to be at the front.
But a girl has to be at the front,
Yeah.
right? So then, so if a girl has to be at the front, you could, of course, you could do girl, boy, right? But if you have to have everyone in a row, you need 2 times as many boys as girls. So you need some combination. So for every girl, there needs to be 2 boys. So then you would be left with an extra boy, an extra boy. Okay. Yeah. So you'd eventually end up with 2 boys, right? Of course, you could move this girl to the end, so she could be last, right? She could be last, but then you have 4 boys in a row. So either way, you have to have two boys standing next to each other, right? But you kind of just, all you have to do is really take this sentence and turn it into an equation. So you just have to be like boy, boy, girl, girl, and then you have to be like, okay, well if the girl goes in front, it's either girl, boy, boy, or, well, it has to be girl, boy, boy at some point. Just kind of logically speaking. Because the only time when you don't have them, two boys standing next to each other, is this possibility, right? Yeah.
You could have more girls and more boys.
Huh?
You could have more girls and more boys.
Yes, but then at some, you have to make up for the number of boys later on in the line, though. Okay. Like if you did you put the girl here and then another girl there, you would have to add more. Okay. That's just a really quick math thing. So we're not okay. So we're gonna move on to writing. Okay, so the two things you want to do for writing, so remember writing has an essay portion and a grammar portion, right? So for the grammar, you want to review your grammar concepts, but you also want to know what kind of common tricks show up, because it's basically going to be like the same trick in like 5 different outfits, kind of. So it's like the same question, but they're going to give it to you in different ways. So what I've given you here is 2 very, very common kinds of tricks that they're going to have. Okay, so there are 2 different kinds of tricks in the 2 examples that I'm giving you. And basically a lot of the test is the same variation of the same trick. So read over the first sentence and tell me what's wrong with it. Look, you know too much. Okay.
The pronoun there is unclear.
The pronoun there. Why is it unclear?
Because it sounds like they're talking about people's ability to eat large numbers.
So it sounds like people are eating a lot of bugs, which is possible in some parts of the world, but probably not what they mean here. What do they actually mean?
The bats.
The bats, right? They're actually talking about the bats. So how can we fix the sentence?
Because of bats' abilities to eat large numbers of insects, some people are building bat houses.
Okay, so we could say bats here, right? Bats, apostrophe at the end. What's another way we could fix it?
But just like bat houses after the club, like directly after the club.
That house.
Does it say bat houses?
Wait, what's happening?
No, wait.
You can put your second half of the
Some
sentence.
people are building bat houses in the blanket because that's too
Okay, so then you would be moving the entire sentence, the because under,
yeah.
and you're saying what? You're saying, because bats eat large number of insects, right? So yeah, I like, this way you'd shorten the sentence up too, right? You don't necessarily have to move it down here, actually. You could just say, because you still need bats to show up in the bottom for it to be clear who it is. So you could say, because bats eat large numbers of insects, some people are building bat houses in their backyard, right? And that clears up who our pronoun is, right? So this same question actually comes up a lot. So one of the kind of ways to deal with the tricks in passages is to kind of be like, anytime you see certain kinds of words, that's probably the thing you have to pay attention to. There's no reason to have a sentence with a pronoun if they're not testing you on pronouns. So, pronouns antecedent, or if it's probably anytime you see there in it, right? So if you see a question with there, then you're going to be like, okay, does that make sense? And that makes, every time you spot what kind of question it is, that's gonna help you answer it. If you just read the question and then look for the right answer in the multiple choice, sometimes you're gonna be misled because one of them sounds better than the other. A lot of people who answer grammar questions, they go by sound. They're like, oh, well, that one sounds like it makes sense more than the other one. But you really wanna know, like, this question is wrong because of this reason. And so any question that has this problem, they're wrong for the same way, and you're gonna solve the problem in the same way, right? So anytime you see a question like this, you're gonna know that you're gonna have to solve it by clarifying what that word is. Or switching it around, and maybe making bats your subject. So because of their ability to eat large insects, bats now have houses in people's backyards. That might be one way to fix it. Let's look at the second question. So, we'll read it out first. So the accidental tourist features a character whose obsession with saving money and time are absurd, yet somehow plausible.
R is wrong
Okay. Why is R wrong?
because obsession is singular.
Yes. Okay, so we got obsession R. Right? So how do we fix it?
Is.
Right, okay, so obsession is. So one thing you want to pay attention to when you do grammar is you obviously want to pay attention to pronouns. If there's any comparisons, you want to pay attention to that because they have comparison questions. But the other thing you want to pay attention to is just basic structure of a sentence, subject, verb, object, right? Are those three things there? So we actually have two verbs in the sentence. What's our first verb? Features, right? So what features? Okay, so our subject is the accidental tourist, and the accidental tourist features a character. And then whose obsession? So the character's obsession, right? So whose, a pronoun, always refers back to the word right before it. If it doesn't, then you're wrong. It's wrong. But you also want to make sure that the thing that it refers to, right, is the right thing. If it was a when or a where or that, it's wrong. If I said the accidental tourist features a character that thinks saving money is absurd, that's still wrong. Because a person, a character cannot be a that, it's a who. Yeah. So you want to make sure every part of the sentence kind of grammatically makes sense. So we got subject, verb, object, right? And then the whose refers to character, so the whose is correct. And then you've got obsession with saving time and money. So this describes what kind of obsession, right? So the fact that it's time and money and that it's plural doesn't matter because it's not part of our basic sentence structure, which is obsession is absurd, right? So singular, which is absurd, yet somehow plausible. So we're saying the obsession is absurd, but also, right, yet also plausible. Adjectives. So you want to be aware of kind of our basic sentence structures there. So these are actually two very, very common errors that they tend to ask you to fix on the grammar section. One is pronoun antecedent agreement, and then one is subject verb agreement. So basically anytime you see a verb, you're going to have to be like, is that the right one? And the other thing that you're going to notice, so with subject verb agreement, they always try to trick you by putting something plural here. So it's always going to be something plural and then singular, or something plural on this side and then something singular is. Like, you can spot these errors if you know what the structure is, because the structure is kind of the same all the time. And then you can get all of those questions correct. I'm going to erase this. And then we're going to look really quickly at another sample prompt to kind of bring us back to the essay. You guys can read this one really quickly. There's one to tell us that only victory will do. question is, can a loss ever be more valuable than a victory, right? So how do we tackle this prompt?
Use the question, you can learn from failures.
And learn from failures?
You can learn from your loss, like losing.
Okay, so we could put learn here, right? Learn. How else can we tackle it?
Who's loss and victory?
Wait, what?
Who's loss or victory?
Okay, so who is losing versus this victory, right? Do you have an example? Because I have one in my head.
No.
Okay, well, if we're talking about who, right? Like, what if it's like Hitler's loss? Is that more valuable than
It's more valuable to us for that.
Yeah. So you do want to actually ask the question, whose loss, right? Whose victory? That is one thing you want to ask yourself. What else?
Well, it says how we manage our losses, so it might be after you lose what you do about it.
Okay. So, like, what do you do, right? After. Okay. So that might be one way to go. Anything else? Yes. Okay. So key terms, right? So valuable. So short term, long term. Okay. So we've kind of just broken down our prompt here. What do we mean by loss? Whose loss is it? What do we mean by victory? Whose victory is it? What is valuable? Are you counting valuable in terms of money, power, respect? I don't know, like brownie points. What do you count as valuable? The other thing, though, is you guys haven't looked at the big chunk of text here, which gives you a lot of information. How can we use the stuff above to our advantage? We've said one way to define it is manage your losses. What else?
Because most people say like, I can learn from my loss, but the reason you're learning from losing is to actually gain a victory. So in the end, wouldn't they consider victory more like better than losing? Like, there's this train of thought, like why do people say they can learn from losing? So they can win, right?
So
ultimately winning is like,
more important. Possibly. That's a little bit of roundabout thinking. Possibly. I'll show you guys the next slide really quick because we're running out of time. But one other thing that you guys haven't pointed out is the word ever. So they're asking you one side or the other, right? You want to pick loss or victory. But the way that they're phrasing their question, you almost have to pick yes. Because if it's ever, so have your teachers ever told you should never say never or always? Right? Because there's always an exception, right? So if the question is, can a loss ever be more valuable? You kind of have to take the standpoint, yes it can. Because otherwise you're going to spend your entire essay arguing why there are no exceptions. Which is like really hard to do and also like probably wrong. So it's not what you want to do. So the first thing you want to do is break apart your prompt before you even think about what you're going to write about. So dissect the prompt, define your terms, right? So we did that. So one good thing that we did is we pointed out what the 3 important terms to define are, right? But what we didn't really make use of is the description above. And most people tend to skim it and then just ignore it, or they don't even read it. They just read the question and they go, right? But there's a lot of information in this prompt. what we get is our leaders love to tell us that only victory will do, as if they are imparting great knowledge. They seek only to defeat the enemy to achieve the goal. So this tells us what the other side is thinking, because we've already decided we have to say yes, right? So if we're going to be like, yes, so these are the people who say no. So whenever you have to address the other side, you could just point to that, right? You don't have to kind of imagine who your opponent is in your imaginary debate in this essay. You already have it right there in the prompt. So you don't have to make that up, it's already there. But also, your point of view that you can take, points that you have, it's already here too, right? So yet, many times a loss, particularly one that is hard fought, is more valuable than a victory. We cannot live a life full of victories, nor should we. So this could be one paragraph, right? The quality of our lives depends as much on how we manage our losses as on how we achieve our victories. So this could be another paragraph, right? So you kind of have your essay structure kind of given to you, if you want, or if you're stuck, because they kind of give it to you in the prompt. So you've already kind of gotten paragraph 1 and 2. You just have to think of examples for it. You have your counterexample, because it's like this guy, right? And then you just have to say why he's wrong, right? So that's kind of how you can use the prompt to your advantage if you have trouble brainstorming. And then when you look at it, you want to make a pro-con list. So you want to have 3 body paragraphs. 2 is the minimum if you can't write a lot. But you want to try to go for 3. So what I would usually do is make a pro-con list. And then the first one that you have 2 for, that's the side you're going to pick. And then the one that you only have 1 for, that's going to be the side that's your counter-argument. That way your brainstorming goes really quick, because you're not just like, you don't pick a side and then think of your examples, because it could be hard. You think of your kind of reasoning, and then the one that you can support more, pick that side. Does that kind of make sense? So we've already said yes, we're going to pick 2 reasons that we found, and then we're going to consider the other side. And that's kind of going to be the easy brainstorming thing to do. And then you want to kind of pick your things from, personal life, history, current events, literature, movies, pop culture, whatever you want. We're kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to go over this really quickly. But the basic structure is kind of like a 5-paragraph essay structure, with a little bit of a twist. So here, I'll erase these marks. So our twist is actually that you guys should all have some form of an acknowledgement and response. So instead of having 3 kind of reasons that go into the same sort of topic, like, here are my 3 reasons why losses are more important than victories, right? Because that's super elementary and boring. You're going to do 2 of those. And then your third one, you're going to acknowledge what someone on the other side would say, right? Someone who's going to say, well, victories are actually more important. And then you respond by saying, well, you're wrong because, right? So you always want to kind of acknowledge that there is another side, because if you're kind of just like, I'm the only one who's right and there's no reason why anyone would think the other way, then why are you debating this in the first place, right? If they're asking the question, it's controversial, which means there is an opponent to your argument, and you have to address that to make a good argument. So you should have an acknowledgement. And then the conclusion, a lot of the time people just kind of restate their thesis, but a good conclusion kind of asks the next question, like, so what? So why is it important? Why is it important to address this injustice, if you remember the first prompt that we did? Or why is it important to acknowledge the benefit of losses? You want to kind of think why at the very end of your essay, because that's kind of going to make it a little bit more sophisticated and not just like, okay, you just copied your thesis again at the end. And then what we talked about before, so the last 2 points of your essay are probably grammar and style. So if you don't have grammar errors, if you use, SAT words, right? And if you have kind of good style, sentence variation, kind of a variation between different kinds of transition words, complicated structures, that kind of thing, that's sort of like the last 2 points of your essay. Do you guys have any questions? Writing questions? I know some of you guys brought in essays that you've written, so we can talk about that after. Otherwise, if you have any questions, you can email me or our office, or you can come and ask me questions after. Thanks for coming.
What's your pictures?
It's like
Pictures. Right here?